For 500 years, explorers searched for El Dorado, a golden king, a city of treasure. Armies vanished, maps lied, and rivers swallowed men whole. But what if the real El Dorado was here all along, hidden beneath the Amazon? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. They called it a kingdom because they needed a name for their hunger. For 1,000 years, Europe dreamed in gold, on parchment maps, in monastery cellars, and the mouths of sailors too drunk to steer straight. It was always the same whisper: gardens in the west, rivers that rolled up nuggets like apples, islands with cinnamon trees, and temples made of metal. When Columbus described the Indies, it wasn't with a compass or a chronometer. He used Genesis and rumor, a sea that smelled of paradise, shores where naked men held feathers like relics, a place where Eden had drifted after the fall. Geography bent under desire. So when the caravels bumped against the bones of a continent big enough to swallow Europe whole, the men who stepped ashore were already looking through a keyhole carved by legend. And when they looked, what they saw did not disappoint. Tenochtitlan bloomed on the water like a hallucination. Cusco shone with the breath of the sun. In Coricancha, the temple of gold, every leaf and stalk and bird was forged to mirror the thing it imitated, as if metallurgy itself had been born just to flatter creation. It was too much to believe, and so they believed it everywhere. If Mexico and Peru held such marvels, surely the equatorial belt, where the sun burned closest, was a string of Perus waiting to be counted and melted. The air itself, some claimed, birthed gold in the soil. And if that wasn't a miracle enough, there were stories of another place. A place not where gold was found, but where gold was worshipped. Not currency, sacrament. East of the Andes, the whisper thickened into prophecy. A lake rimmed in emerald, a city that gleamed like noon, a man who wore the sun on his skin. They named him El Dorado, the gilded one. A ceremony, a vow, a body turned into light. On the cold Bogota plateau, where breath fogs the air and the lakes hold secrets, the Muiscas lived inside a clock made of salt and sky. They weren't Incas, they weren't Aztecs, they were themselves, a people of weavers and traders, astronomers and oath keepers, their territory stitched together by moorland trails and ceremonial lakes. Gold to them was not wealth, it was grammar. The breath of the sun hardened into metal, a way to speak to the gods. Esmeraldas belonged to the moon. Salt was their coin, yes, but also a covenant. Trade routes braided through the highland and the lowland. From Zipaquira and Nemocon, great teeth of salt were pried loose and carried to market, exchanged for feathers, copper, cacao, and the gold that came upriver from the east. That plateau glittered not because it was rich, but because it was connected. And because the sun needed to be returned, they returned it. Before dawn, the lake held its breath. Guatavita, black as a pupil, a raft slid out. On it, the new ruler, his skin smeared with resin, dusted with gold until he burned like a second sun. At his feet, offerings, tanjos, tiny human figures made of metal, beads, raw gold. Drums murmured. The raft reached the center. The Zipa lifted his hands. The gifts fell into the lake. And then he stepped in too, the gold slipping from him like melted light, not treasure, theology. When the Spaniards came, stinking, starving, blood-dumb and hollow-eyed, they saw the echo of that language and mistook it for a vault. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada staggered onto the plateau through a nightmare of mud, mosquitoes, and hunger so savage it ate his horses. And then, Bacata. Mantles of cotton, goldsmiths with hands like sorcerers, and in Hunza, Camoenchetocha, draped in gold, surrounded by silence. In Sogamoso, the Sun Temple held mummies and relics older than the thirst of Spain. When the torches came, the flame didn't just consume, it translated. The priest refused to flee. The fire whispered its name in the only language it knew. Bright, final. Smoke climbed. Cloth vanished. The invaders called it a victory, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it. A language is being burned. However, the misunderstanding wasn't solely driven by greed. It was grammar, The Muiscas kept saying what they always had: wealth is to be offered, to balance the sky, to make the soil say yes. The Spaniards heard only, wealth is elsewhere, east, 4 days away, another chief, another lake, another promise. So Quesada carved his maps with a sword. Belalcazar rose from Quito with a hunger for cities. Fetterman slipped down from Coro with ledgers for eyes. In 1539, they met in Bacata and turned one man's ceremony into a country you could chase, a movable feast, a license. By 1540, Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo had put it into writing, a king who dusted himself in gold every morning, bathed in a lake, and did it all again tomorrow. A fable so good it didn't need to be true, a sentence so sharp it could cut maps. The appetite was no longer just Spanish, it had expanded. It was human. They chased the name through fog and rot. Manoa, Meta, Prime, Paititi, Omagua. Gonzalo Pizarro led an expedition east with 340 men and 4,000 porters. Francisco de Orellana split off with a skeleton crew and a makeshift boat and discovered the river that would later name half the continent. It pulled him all the way to the sea. And along that road of water, Carvajal, a friar with ribs for keys, wrote of plazas, women with bows, causeways, towns mirrored across the banks, like dreams pressed into the jungle. The crown called it madness. Pedro de Ursua tried to prove it sane and died for his trouble. Lope de Aguirre made it a tragedy. Raleigh turned it into poetry and then into a beheading. Mapmakers gave the lie to the existence of a lake. It stayed on the page for 150 years. But underneath the ruin, something real flickered. The refrain returned, soft as water. The gold is not ours, it comes from the east. Not from mines, but from motion. Not from veins and mountains, but from rivers that change their script with the rain. The Muiscas weren't hiding a horde, they were describing a network. So the conquistadors went looking for a pile and missed the choreography. They reached lakes and tore them apart like safes. Guatavita, they cut into it like a fruit, found trinkets, found silence, missed the point. The lake was not the vault was the system. The gold was not the gold was the grammar. And now we know. Because the forest has started whispering back. With Lidar, dark earth, and satellite eyes, we are finally learning to read the old grammar, not in gold, but in pattern, in roads that pulse like veins, in fields that breathe, in raised berms, canal webs, and plazas that do not rise like pyramids, but ripple like memories. Llanos de Mojos, Upano Valley, Xingu, Santarem, not cities of conquest, cities of calibration, garden urbanism, landscapes engineered not for empire, but for endurance, not to withstand invasion, but to understand the season. El Dorado was never a throne, it was a method. And the Muiscas weren't liars, they were translators. They were pointing east, toward neighbors who grew wealth in cycles, who spoke in flood and compost, who made the ground remember. The Spaniards chased a lake and found only a reflection. But if you look now, from the air, through the trees, past the scars of chainsaws and highways, the pattern begins to flicker again. A mesh of systems, a choreography of survival, a city that breathes through memory. And it begins with a year that has been set like a stone in the riverbed, 1542. The equator glitters at noon and broods at dusk. The current is the color of brewed tea. A column of men, sharpened to hunger and hope, lets their canoes slip south and east into a road that moves. They have a captain named Orellana and a witness named Carvajal. The empire behind them will call what is about to be written a fever. The forest will call it testimony, and the cities that breathe under leaves will not call it anything at all. They will endure, exhaling their old grammar into a century still too young to hear it. It begins with a river the color of brewed tea and a sky that sweats. In 1542, the world was still being redrawn by blood and compass. A battered column of men, sunburned, starving, their armor stained by jungle rot, slid their canoes into the endless brown current and whispered prayers the river would not devour them. At the helm was Francisco de Orellana, but the eyes we remember belonged to a friar, Gaspar de Carvajal, thin with hunger, writing with trembling hands under the canopy's wet breath. What he recorded should have changed the world. He claimed to see towns, real towns, along the Amazon's banks, roads, plazas, towers, bridges, and people by the tens of thousands. Europe refused to believe him. Back in Spain, they called it delirium, a hallucination born of exhaustion and jungle rot. After all, this was the Amazon, chaotic, hostile, impossible. a place for rubber trees and fever, not for cities. But what if Carvajal wasn't hallucinating? What if the jungle wasn't lying, only hiding? What if the rainforest, long rumored to hoard El Dorado, was protecting something even more profound? Cities not carved from stone, but coaxed from soil and water? Not empires of gold, but civilizations of gardens. The first real crack in the old story didn't come with gold or temples. It came from dirt. For generations, farmers in the Amazon had stumbled across patches of jet-black soil. Terra Preta, they called it. It was fertile in a rainforest famous for soil so poor it couldn't grow a single decent crop without modern help. Scientists eventually looked closer. Under the microscope, it sang a different tune. Charcoal, fish bones, potsherds, organic waste, layer upon layer, laid down with purpose. This was engineered soil, a pantry built by ancient hands. It whispered of long-term settlement, of people who didn't just survive the jungle. They tamed it, transformed it. The soil spoke of houses, of families, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next, of urban possibility in a place we'd written off as wild. And then came the light. The canopy ripped open Lidar, light detection and ranging. A beam that pierces the canopy and returns a skeleton of the land beneath. No machetes needed, no trails, no guesswork, just truth from above. When Lidar scanned Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos, it shattered centuries of denial. Beneath the forest, hidden beneath centuries of vines and silence, lay cities. Not huts or camps. Cities. Causeways stretched like the spokes of a cosmic wheel. Terraces rose, reservoirs shimmered. Conical pyramids guarded ceremonial centers aligned to the north-northwest, as if drawn by the stars. Kotoka, Landivar, names we barely knew before, now revealed as massive hubs in a four-tiered urban web. And these were not dense cities of stone. They breathed with the floodplain, not against it. They rose from earth, not granite. Their grandeur was not height, but reach. They called it low-density urbanism. But what it really meant was that we had been blind. Yet the most unsettling secret of all was buried further west, where the Andes bleed into the jungle and the sky drops curtains of mist. In Ecuador's Upano Valley, Lidar told another story. Straight roads ran like veins across the forest. Plazas bloomed in geometric silence. More than 6,000 earthen platforms appeared, grouped like syllables in a forgotten language. It wasn't random, it wasn't recent, it was deliberate, and it was old, older than the Roman Empire. The cities of the Upano were already pulsing with life by 500 BCE and endured for over 1,000 years. Their roads stretched tens of kilometers. Their plazas hosted ceremonies, trade, daily life. Their homes were planted like crops between gardens and orchards. Archaeologists call it garden urbanism, a city not of walls, but of breathing systems. Europe came looking for Atlantis, but here, in the lungs of the earth, it had missed a miracle made of mud, not marble. These were not cities swallowed by the jungle. These were cities the jungle grew around. So, what of El Dorado? For centuries, explorers chased a city of gold, a king dusted in glitter, a treasure that would make empires bow. But what if they misunderstood the legend? What if the real treasure wasn't gold, but balance, knowledge? El Dorado, born from Muisca ritual near Lake Guatavita, was never meant to be a place on a map. It was an idea. But Europeans came with fire and greed. They melted truth into myth. Lidar reveals a different truth, a truth that cannot be smelted or stolen. Cities that mapped flood cycles, garden soil, managed water like memory. Cities that built with the land, not over it. Carvajal's fever dream now reads like a prophecy. His towns were not hallucinations. They were nodes in a vast, delicate network, some on rivers, some inland, all now blurred by time and vine. This was not an empty jungle. It was a heavily edited manuscript, and we are finally learning to read the footnotes. But the jungle does not forgive delay. The same Lidar that reveals ancient roads now shows modern scars. Illegal roads, slash and burn fields, flames chewing through centuries of silence. We are racing a clock. Every dry season clears another chapter before we can scan it. Every bulldozer erases a story older than conquest. In Mojos, the canals still gleam blue in the grass if the light hits just right. In the Upano, the long avenues still stretch like ghosts between trees, if you know how to look. The tragedy is not that we didn't find the lost cities. The tragedy is that we might find them, just in time to lose them again. So listen closely. To the river, to the soil, to the forest that remembers what we forgot. Carvajal saw plazas. We see Lidar echoes. Both are saying the same thing. This civilization wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it did. Not in gold or conquest, but in earth, in pattern, in the quiet miracle of knowing how to live with the forest, not against it. The jungle did not hide a miracle of gold. It kept something rarer, proof that we were the ones who were lost all along. Gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.